Sure. So originally I was hired as the syndicated product manager. So I deal with all the syndicated reports that we do for clients every year. So any client can purchase it. It's the trackers, whether it's the US tracker, the EU tracker, or some healthcare provider trackers. More recently, I was promoted to VP of Research Production. So it's much more of a logistics position rather than a product manager position. Which is why we got so involved with Indico, because it really was about being more efficient across all the divisions that do reporting for us. So we don't want to be duplicating efforts, especially with the trackers, where it's the exact same data we report over and over and over again, and we needed to find more efficient ways to do that. So my team is typically the tracker team, which is a group of analysts, as well as a couple senior managers who deal with custom studies in quantitative and qualitative. We ran into difficulty when we had one of our associates leave after a year. So we suddenly found ourselves with a tracker that had a first year running the whole thing with no senior person to help her, which was originally 6 European countries plus Canada, which happens twice a year. So it's 6 countries, Canada, 7 countries, plus an EU overview. So it was 8 reports that she had to do by herself twice a year. And it was just daunting. And we didn't want to burn out our current staff trying to cover the slack of a full-bodied associate that should have been there for an entire year. So we had reached out to Indico and kind of asked for a capabilities presentation with, how can you help us? What can we do? And that's when we started discussing automating the European reports. The core slides, which repeat for every single country that we do. And that was in 23 that I think we did that initial programming when we had lost that associate to the cycle. And so we essentially automated, we did an upfront investment in automation, and we're able to get all of those 8 reports out on time that first year down a full employee at a fraction of the cost that it would have cost to either hire another associate or get contractors to do the work. The automation, typically they turn around a 100-slide report for us every 2 days, which is just phenomenal. And it really allowed us to not just succeed in 23 down a person, we're now at a full complement. And so we added another country. So it's now up to 9 reports this year for both the first half of the year and second half of the year. So that really allowed us to not just get through 23 when we thought we were going to be in a lot of trouble. Typically, our custom work really amps up in fourth quarter, and we would not have had the capacity to do that if we had been pulling all these associates over to cover the missing person. So it has worked out really, really well for us. We're currently exploring whether or not we can use the base automation that we've done and mirror it in the US. US tracker publishes every quarter, so 4 times a year. Similar size report, it's usually about 130, 150 slides, of which we think about 75 may have already been programmed for the EU. So we're looking into whether the data is set up in the same way and whether or not we can use the same programming base to generate those slides. Hopefully, we're hoping. As much as we would love for the tracker to stay relatively stable, that never quite happens. The majority of it is stable. The majority of it runs wave over wave over wave. But we have to update programming for automation anytime like there's a new brand come into the market, or in the US, it would be a new FDA approval. So suddenly our pick list that used to be 5 brands is now 7. Which will impact the automation. So we have to update little tweaks like that. So we just built that into our budget to have a certain amount of money put aside every time we run the tracker to tweak the programming. So usually while we're in field, we send those changes over and they just update the programming, and then we can just run on time, which is just amazing. The biggest impact we saw the first year was it allowed it changed the entire feeling and the morale in the office for the associates in the program, where they entered the year really in a bit of a state of panic, because we didn't know how the work was going to happen. Like, we knew it had to happen, but we couldn't figure out how it was going to happen. And so this was a solution that did require some investment up front in terms of time and effort and programming and really getting all of our ducks in a row, because we were brand new to it and there was a bit of a learning curve. But the relief in the office, the feeling of the associates where they were like, oh, this is the new normal. The new normal is we get a report turned around every 2 days. And we have to work on our side of it, which is the custom questions, the snapshot questions that are not programmed or automated. So there's still that work that has to be done, but they are now free to do that work without the weight of the deadline looming and the amount of work that has to be done. Adding another country, adding another 100 slides onto their workload was a big deal. And it didn't faze them because they knew that they had this framework put into place that would allow them the time to focus on adding a new country, which is, from scratch. There's quite a bit of work that you have to do to kind of create, like, none of the tracking slides are tracking slides, right? They're all point in time. They're all wave one. So there's a lot of kind of manual first wave kind of issues that we have to do. But they were not concerned about it because they knew that the rest of the process would work by itself. So I think morale was a huge component, knowing that was there. And certainly the analysts feel like they're doing better, more useful work when their time is spent doing analysis and not updating charts. That's a little soul sucking when you know that you have 1,500 slides that you just have to update the charts. That's not a good use of their time. We would rather they spent their time doing the analysis portion of the research versus the busy work. Yeah, there's two pieces to it. One, obviously, that you have to, and again, this is with any tool, and we've seen it with multiple different tools, that there's this initial pushback with, I don't have the time to learn something new. I just need to get my job done. And so there's a certain amount of effort that you have to kind of push from the management side of it to say, this will make your life easier. This will make your life more productive. We have to put in a little bit of work up front to see the benefit on the back. So the learning curve for us was working with the team, the automation team, and them saying, okay, this is how you give us notes. This is how you annotate every slide. This is how you set up your data tables on the back end, on the crosstabs. And we've made several improvements since then, where we figured out on our end, gosh, we can save a lot of time if we run all the crosstabs for all the countries all at once and export them on like an Excel tab file versus trying to do each one individually. So we saved ourselves a lot more time that way. And the Indico team was great in terms of figuring out how they could do a programming fix on their end so that format, which was way easier on us, then would run properly on their side. So I think it certainly has been a learning process on both sides for us to know how to update the programming. Oh, we have 3 new slides that need to be done, but we know how to do them, so we don't have to do this back and forth. But also realizing that Indico has been incredibly responsive to our requests with whether it's a couple new slides, can this be done? Is there a workaround so that we can do this easier cross-tabbing method on our side that'll save us a lot of time? I mean, if you can imagine, for the 100 slides that we have to do, to have to create every single one of those crosstabs for those 100 slides and then do it again 9 more times. And now we can do everything but Canada all at once. We can simply say, run it for every country individually, tab it, and it runs once. And we can then pass that along. So that was a huge time saver on our side. And it eliminates mistakes. When you go and you individually do 100 crosstabs 9 times, you're just opening yourself up for human error. We do, and I know Indico does on their end, they do an extensive QC to make sure everything's right. We do an extensive QC on our end just for one country. Because they were all run at once, we know if the one is right, they're all right. So we essentially, when we used to have to QC 1,500, 1,800 slides, now we do one set. And that's just an amazing time saver on our end, knowing the data's right for all of those slides. It was terrifying. And again, I fall back on we had to do it. So when we looked at possible alternatives, and of course we looked around at other things, and I had some, since I've been in syndicated research for a long time, I've dealt with a lot of other companies where we worked months trying to get an automation in place and was never happy with it. This was the first solution that I looked at. And again, it was nice because we had already created the relationship with Indico with the original PowerPoint kind of builder, and which was a little clunky in the beginning and got better over time as, new updates came. But it's, and the new one, the next gen, is even better, which we love, and makes life a little easier when we do updated. And DashBox, I love DashBox, because I no longer do pages and pages and pages of demos at the end of all of these reports. I just put in a little link. I run it once, I drop the link in, done. And that was a huge time saver. But I think having that relationship was great. We were still super, super nervous, just because it was such a huge swath of our business, and it is an investment up front in time and money. But the team that we worked with on the automation side was so good and so supportive, and really let us, kind of wade through, make some mistakes, try again. And again, we did QC that first wave like a bunch of, OCD crazy people, like just to make sure it was right. And now we don't. Now we only do the one report because we know the programming is all right and in place. And we only have to check one report of the 9 to know all the 9 are right. So I don't think we'll ever give up fully the need to double check everything, but we've given up a lot of it and just trust in the automation and trust in the process. But giving up that much work was absolutely terrifying. The most important thing was the work got done, right? The work got done, and the employees were not stressed out. And they, that first year when it could have been an utter disaster. And I'm sure there's economies of scale that a larger company could take use of. But for our little company, it was a matter of, when you're down one person, that impacts everybody. Like, it's such a huge chunk of the work is done by that one person that it was, I'm sure as we get bigger, we'll figure out more and more things. And that's certainly the intent, to slowly move more things over as we grow. I don't know how many more countries we want to add. I have had people ask. That's certainly a thought. We've talked about whether we're going into Asia Pacific at some point. And that would be the same thing. We'd set it up the same way and just use the programming that we have, update it where needed. I don't know what the timeline is, but 100% we would not be able to even consider that kind of expansion unless we had this in place. It wouldn't be possible right now. Sure. So the SlideGen, again, much better tool than the initial PowerPoint builder because you can upload the slides. So one of the things that we do in the trackers is, and this crosses over between the US and the EU, is each wave we do what we call snapshots. So something that's very timely or topical, like if we've gotten word that there's a new product in the pipeline that may or may not be approved for use soon, right? And because our clients tell us, they tell us, we have a device that's currently in the pipeline and we think it's going to get FDA approval for launch in fourth quarter or next year in second half of the year. So we can run those through, and it's a very standard kind of 6 or 7 question little snapshot of what do you think of this? We give them the description. Would you ask your doctor? How do you think this is for you? How likely are you to switch? And then if we're going to do it, we set up the slides for the very first wave, upload it, and then we can just flip out the data for the different countries. So it's not something that you would automate because you don't do it every wave. You just drop it in where you need one. So it doesn't make sense really. Or like the hypoglycemia, that was a snapshot that turned into an abstract, that turned into an oral presentation, that one of the analysts said, hey, I think this would be really interesting to know what patients say about hypoglycemia. How sensitive are they to it? How often do they check? And dropped it in, again, not something you'd automate because you don't need to ask about it more than once every 2-3 years. Like those numbers aren't going to change. But we could drop it in, do the like 3-4 slides the first time, and then use SlideGen to swap out all the countries and kind of update it for each country. So it's been incredibly useful that way. And now that we have the concept test, and we ask the exact same question every single time for a concept test, that little template can be used anytime we use a concept test across any kind of device, any kind of drug. It's all the same. It's all going to look the same. And that standardization makes your reports look cleaner. Like the clients come to expect it. Oh, those are the concept test slides. And they all look the same every time. So that's certainly helpful. I mean, if you get an analyst, you can give them the template, but it doesn't always come out the exact same every time. It's just cleaner this way. And then, of course, we've used, I guess twice, we've used the manual updates from Indico just when we had no bandwidth to do a project. And both times it was a custom client who had done one wave and then wanted to do a second wave. And we thought we would have the bandwidth to do it, but they both landed in fourth quarter and we just didn't. So that was very, very easy to just pass off and say, you know, here's the 50 slide deck. I've put notes on every page and I'm going to send you the crosstabs, and they just updated everything. And then we did all the analysis. So it was just it's a great option for those one-off projects that make sense that you can outsource. We're still going to do the analysis. Like we're still going to do, because we understand what the client's objectives were, what they're looking for, what their concerns are, and the diabetes market as a whole. But to have that kind of valve release when we're just super stressed in the fourth quarter and we can't get it done was incredibly useful. And I had 2 senior managers who used that in 23. And I would not be at all surprised if we do it again in 24. I use it right now for all the demographics for the trackers. So I guess when I first took over the syndicated product, like in 21, they did a chart for every single demographic that we asked, and they put it in the back of the deck. So there was like 30 plus slides of one chart per slide for like gender and income and education and ethnicity. And it was just a lot of charts. And then I said, and I'm not sure why we're doing this if we're not showing it trended, because the point of looking at a demographic is to show that your sample is relatively stable, so that when you're showing trended data, you're saying, this is apples to apples. This is the market as we've surveyed it. And if there's a change in data, like if there's a sudden uptick in awareness, you want to say, well, is this driven by a change in demographic? Like, did we suddenly sample more women than men? Is that what's driving this change? So the whole point in having demographics in the deck is if there's a change in data, you can go look and say, well, where's the shift, right? So we changed it to all tables so that we could show trends over time. And that just means that you've got 800 single cells that you have to fill in every time you run the tracker, which again makes it very, very easy to make a mistake when you have just these massive number of tables in the back that you're trying to trend and stat test. And oh God, it was just a lot of effort and time to do that. But it is very important from the client perspective that they have access to those numbers so that, you know, when they're in a meeting and somebody says, well, what could be driving this change? Well, let's go back and look at the demos. So now I can put in a DashBox. I can run all the relative demos that are important to any client. I can add the stat testing. They just have to click the button to add the stat testing wave over wave over wave. And then anything they want to dig up, they can just click on the DashBox and go in and play with it. And we don't have any errors on our part. We don't have the time suck. We started doing it in the EU, that very first wave, and we have not had a single client come back and complain about it. It takes me less than 10 minutes to set up the DashBox for the entire EU report. It's such a time saver. And we know it's accurate, which is even better. Like the data's got to be right. And this way we know that it is right, that the stat testing's done right, and that clients can access this and do a lot of that stuff on their own. I think one of the things that I would say I have found very useful in working with Indico is the level of customer service that we've received. I think Adam has been just spectacular with reaching out to us if there's something new in the pipeline, if he wants us to beta test it. It's been a very high level of communication. And as I mentioned before, the automation team has really bent over backwards to help get us up to speed. When we were in a big panic, they were very understanding. They got us where we needed to be. If there's any issues with question on process or pricing or formatting or, you know, changing the data tabs or how we do it, they've been incredibly responsive, fast, and accurate. And I think for us, especially, these are very young associates fresh out of college, and to be able to get an answer quickly has been super useful for them. And it does give me a high level of confidence in the work that's being done on the back end that I don't see. And I think it's a good lesson for them also to know when you have somebody that's super, super responsive, then you feel like, okay, I can trust this person. They're putting in the time and the effort to make it work. And that's kind of what I like to see from a vendor. The vendors that we have fired, and we have fired a lot of vendors, whether it's a translation vendor or a sample provider, you always know quickly which ones are going to be problems because they don't get back to you. There isn't that level of trust and communication. They don't treat you like you're an important client. And you can tell that right away when you're going to have a problem with a vendor because the communication is not there. The accuracy is not there. You have to explain things 3 or 4 times. Like they just aren't your partner. And we have really felt like Indico has been a great partner to us. So I would include that as one of the key things that we like about working with Indico.